Satin Bear with Bear Process Safety is the first episode of Breaking Down the Basics, where we break down OSHA PSM standards and regulations for your facility. Today we'll be talking about PSI, and particularly information pertaining to the highly hazardous chemical. One thing that we want to point out when we're talking about this, it's the first thing we always think about: does the chemical have an SDS? And we're going to go over some high-level points on the SDS, some numbers and some data that you want to be looking at, in addition to the normal common things that we look at when we're looking at an SDS. So normally when you pull up an SDS, you're going to have some basic chemical information. First thing you're going to look at as far as hazards: is it flammable? Is it toxic? Is it reactive? Or is there any other thing that you need to know about this chemical? The best way to see that, normally they're on every SDS, is that NFPA diamond. It's red, white, blue, and yellow. It's got corresponding number levels 1 through 4 for each thing. And in terms of if there's any extra thing we need to look at in the white section, you'll have some lettering or wording, like it's an oxidizer, those sort of things. That gives you great basic information of what you're looking at here for the chemical. The next thing that we look at with the chemical a lot of times is it harmful from an occupational sense? Does someone need special protective equipment when they're working with it? If it gets on them, do they need to go to an eye wash station immediately? Do they need to call a doctor? Is it harmful if swallowed? Is it harmful if it gets in your eyes? Is it a carcinogen? Is it harmful to breathe in vapors? Those sort of things. And that's important as well. What I really want to dig into is some more in-depth things that can create bigger hazards for our facilities, our plants, our people, and our receptors. Receptors are just maybe buildings or locations that we've deemed at the plant as a hazardous concern for us that we really want to look at. Someone's going to be stationed there. Maybe it's going to be a lot of damage. Maybe it's going to be a big environmental thing if we have an aquatic space there, and that's what we want to look at. So one thing in particular, everyone knows about boiling point. We normally use boiling point when we're talking about operational aspects, but we want to look at boiling point and vapor pressure to determine volatility. So if something gets spilled out on the ground, if something's in an open-ended container, is it volatile? Is it going to be released? Is it going to create this dispersion envelope, whether it be flammable or toxic? That's going to impact our personnel. So those numbers can tell us a lot about that right off the bat. When we look at something, we can kind of determine what's going to happen in a release. Now, there's more in-depth dispersion analysis. We'll get to that in later trainings. But that number gives you a good open, when you first look at it, hey, this is the concern that I'm looking at. You also want to look at auto ignition temperature, decomposition temperature. These are things that, can the chemical decompose and create a reactive problem? If it's released and let's say it's impinging on something, how hot does that have to get before that impingement creates a fire? So those numbers right off the bat as well, you'll be able to look at those temperature numbers and know, based on your process operations, are you in danger of impacting any of these numbers, okay? One number that's really key that people don't really talk about enough is flash point. Now, flash point's not a physical data number like boiling point. It's a tested number, and there's multiple tests. It's open cup and closed cup tests, but you can normally pretty easily find information on those tests, how those tests were done, just by an easy search online. So what the flash point is going to tell you is in a closed cup scenario, an open cup scenario, so a closed vessel or an open vessel scenario, what temperature does that chemical combine with oxygen to create a flammable mixture if an ignition source is present? So that can be very important information for when we have something that is flammable. So we'll have an example here that we go down step by step and show you some numbers for some different chemicals that you really need to be worried about. And we'll break down in more detail toxic effects and some information that the U.S. Department of Energy gives us to determine how we're impacting our employees from a toxicity level. In that vein, let's take a look at an SDS for acetylene. It's going to give a good example of what we're looking at for flammable materials. We'll also take a look at an SDS for phosgene, so we can kind of talk about some of those toxic numbers that are important. And when we look at these numbers, we're kind of breaking down the basics once again, and I'll kind of explain what it is we're looking at and what's the concern there. One of the things that we talked about here with acetylene is flash point. You can see by looking at this SDS, flash point's very low. It's at 1.4. Or negative 17 degrees Celsius. So what that means is basically at ambient temperature, if it's in a closed cup situation, it's in that and there's an ignition source in there, Acetylene is very flammable. It's going to be at that equilibrium point where it is ignitable. That's the thing with acetylene. As you can see here, the flammability numbers, it's 2.5 to 100% in volume. So that's a huge range that acetylene can be flammable in. Additionally, looking at the auto ignition temperature, it's 305 degrees Celsius, 581 degrees Fahrenheit. You might think that's pretty high, but in an acetylene process, to make acetylene, we're talking about temperatures that are upwards of almost 1,000 degrees. Is not, unforeseen. So realistically, that could happen. So we're talking there about a gas impinging on a piece of equipment that's maybe that hot, and it could actually ignite the acetylene. Additionally, this is a great example of something that you have to worry about decomposition as well. Acetylene does decompose, and if it decomposes, it can form a situation where you've got a deflagration or a detonation if an ignition source is present. So there's other chemicals like that that'll break down at certain temperatures. So this is a good example of some of those flammability points that we were talking about earlier. In terms of volatility, boiling point is negative 84 degrees C, negative 119 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically this stuff gets released, it's well above the boiling point, it's going to flash. So it's very volatile, and you can see that the vapor pressure is very high. It's at 623 psig, or 44 bar. So to that point, again, it's a very volatile substance. If we move over and take a look at the phosgene SDS, really the main concern here is going to be toxicity. That's what I kind of want to point out. If you take a look here at the TWA to the far right, that's, as we talked about, a time-weighted average. It's an 8-hour time-weighted average. We're looking at 0.1 ppm. Okay, so that's going to be a very hazardous chemical that we're looking at. And so we'll kind of get more into that. That's the type of numbers you're looking at. Obviously, below here, danger, toxic, corrosive, high pressure gas, may be fatal if inhaled, can cause eye, skin burns. Those are things that we kind of see when we have a chemical that's got high toxicity. A little skull and crossbones here. It'll give us just kind of, hey, watch out. This is the PPE you need to wear. These are the things you need to do. Take precautions with these. But when we're looking at toxics, that's going to be that main thing we look at, is that TWA. In addition to that, we obviously want to look at the volatility. So we're going to be looking at, as we talked about in the acetylene SDS, the vapor pressure, boiling point, those sort of things.
Another thing to break down more in depth that we talked about earlier is the toxic information for a chemical. What we're looking at there, you can find on pretty much every SDS, is the PEL, or the permissible exposure limit. So this number is detailed by OSHA. There's two ways to look at this number. There's a ceiling value, which means an employee can't be exposed to this much at any point in time without drastic effects. Or there's an 8-hour time-weighted average, or you see it as a TWA, which means that over an 8-hour period, obviously the person can't be exposed to that without drastic consequences. The U.S. Department of Energy, with their Office of Health, Safety, Environmental, and Security, have come out with some more in-depth information as well. Some PAC criteria, or protective action criteria. They break this down into 3 different levels. There's acute exposure guideline levels, AEGLs. There's ERPGs, which are emergency response planning guidelines, or there's temporary emergency exposure limits, which is TEAL. So that's the hierarchy there. That's AEGL, ERPG, TEEL, which is TEALs. And we'll give an example of the database. We'll look up a couple chemicals from a toxic standpoint, from a flammable standpoint, to kind of show you what you're going to see there. But these numbers are important to talk about how they impact our receptors. That's the word we used earlier. Our employees, our environment, our community. A receptor could even be something as kind of just a fence line, maybe. Maybe there's no one on the other side of the fence. But we want to be worried about those when they leave our department, our facility, our unit.
So what I wanted to do here is pull up an example from the Department of Energy website. It's their Protective Action Criteria database. We looked up phosgene. You can look up this very easily if you've got the CAS number, just the chemical number, it'll pull up, or just the chemical name itself. You can try that. If you've got the chemical formula, you can try that. There's a bunch of different ways to find this information. As you can see here in the chem data, it pulls up then properties of the material, which is showing you the vapor pressure, the boiling point. We talked about earlier with volatility, you can see the boiling point is very low. This is going to flash. It's going to be a volatile material. If released, it's going to be, you know, a harmful gas. So when we look at those PAC values, a PAC1, super low. Now look, those data, that first line is in ppm. So you're seeing health effects here at 0.027 ppm, PAC2 at 0.3, and PAC3 at 0.75. That little A designation at the bottom means that there's an AEGL value for this. Now looking here, as you can see at the definitions of AEGL, ERPGs, and the TEALs, at AEGL1, we're looking at experiencing discomfort and irritation for personnel. At 2, you're looking at they could experience irreversible or serious long-lasting health effects. And at 3 is where we could expect a fatality or a death. So that's pretty consistent throughout with ERPG and with the TEALs. These numbers, like I said earlier, are at an hour. That's kind of the basis that we could be exposed to at an hour. That's what this database is reporting. It actually gives, you know, numbers. It can be calculated to give these numbers at lower and higher, lower all the way down to 10 minutes, higher up to 8 hours. But this database, the numbers that you're looking at are reporting people being exposed to this concentration for an hour. So as we talked about with phosgene, these numbers are very, very low. You can look this data up for any chemical. It's a great tool. You can use it with your dispersion models. You can use it just kind of looking at the general toxicity of any chemical.